Okay, so welcome back. This is our 11th lecture in this course, and now we're going to talk about graph decomposition. And graph decomposition is kind of a strange name, but what I'm going to do in this lecture is to continue to study variable elimination and joint trees and compare these two methods and see what are the connections between them. So we know how the algorithms work, but we still have to see how we can build a good joint tree, how we can build a good elimination order, and there is a connection between these two things. So we're going to start with some basic definitions, and I'm going to see how we can connect it, for instance, the width of one elimination order to the width of a joint tree. Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to study some relationships between variable elimination and joint trees. And we can understand both techniques as way of decomposing a network in a systematic way. For instance, variable elimination removes one variable at a time, and factor elimination removes one factor at a time. So we can think that we have the original network, and we start decomposing this network by removing variables or factors. That's why this lecture is called graph decomposition. And we also take this moment to formalize a little bit better some concepts that we haven't seen before. For instance, the width of the elimination order or the tree width, and we want to provide more formal definitions to these ideas. And we also make a connection between what we haven't seen before. And for instance, we will provide a polynomial time algorithm to convert one elimination order into a joint tree, and also a joint tree into elimination order. And those algorithms will be not only polynomial time, but also width preserving. And they will provide a way, for instance, we haven't seen yet a way to build a joint tree. So one way to do that is to start with an elimination order that we know some heuristics to build this elimination order and convert the elimination order into a joint tree. So we're going to start by reviewing some concepts, starting with the modal graphs in the next slide. So we haven't seen before this definition of an interaction graph for a set of factors. And the idea is that it will be an undirected graph that has the same nodes as the variables appearing in the factors, and the edges connect the variables in the same factor. So if we look at a Bayesian network, and like this one here, and we want to make it an interaction graph from this Bayesian network, so we have to first remove the direction of the edges, but also we have to do a modalization process. And the modalization process is a process that we connect a pair of nodes that share a common child. So that's why the name modalization, that it sounds like a bad name, but we created what we call a modal graph. So a modal graph is going to take a Bayesian network and you modalize it, so you get a modal graph. And when you get a modal graph from the Bayesian network, basically what you have as the end result is the interaction graph. So the process of modalization is basically thinking that, for instance, here we have a factor in node A that only mentions the variable A. And here we have another factor for B that only mentions B. But here in D, we have a factor that mentions D, A, and B. Why is that? Because here we have the probability of D given its parents A and B. So this factor will mention these three variables. And the definition of interaction graph is that the edges connect variables in the same factor. So we have these three variables in the same factor. We need then connected by edges. So there will be an edge here, and one edge here that already exists, and one edge here that already exists. And we're going to have to do this same process for this guy here, and the same process for this guy here, and we get this graph on the bottom here. So we can do a modalization and get a modal graph, and the modal graph will be an interaction graph for a Bayesian network. If we have a Markov network, the interaction graph is the Markov network by itself, so we don't have to do anything. right? Because when we think about the Markov network, the definition of the undirected graph is actually to have connections between edges that belong to the same factors. So in the case of the Markov network, we already have an interaction graph. We're going to see during this lecture that the idea is that our definitions and algorithms will run over an undirected graph. So they will be naturally defined for Markov networks. In the case of the Bayesian networks, what we do, we first convert the Bayesian network into a Markov network by doing this process of moralization. And you're going to see that the definitions that work for the interaction graph will also work for the Bayesian networks. So it will be fine. So one example where this idea occurs, that we make a definition for undirected graphs and we extend these to Bayesian networks, to directed graphs, by using the moralization process of Bayesian networks, is the tree width. So we know that the tree width is an important concept for the analysis of the complexity of the inference algorithms, but it is usually defined for undirected graphs. So what we do, we extend the idea of a tree width to dogs by using the idea of modal graphs. So we define the tree width for a dog as the tree width of the modal graph of this dog. And we will later define more formally the tree width for the undirected graphs, but you now have an idea how we're going to do this, right? We first define for the undirected graphs and extend to Bayesian networks through the use of the modal graphs. So we will need a set of definitions for graphs, and we're going to do that in this slide and make it clear for the following ones. So some of these definitions I haven't used before. Some of them are really well known. So the first one is a neighbor. So a neighbor of a node X is a node Y connected to X by one edge in G. So and we also say that X and Y are adjacent. So we can say that, for instance, A is a neighbor of B because they are connected by one edge, and we also say that A and B are adjacent. So a degree of a node X is the number of neighbors of X in the graph G. So for instance, if you look at A has the degree 3 because it has 3 neighbors. B has degree 1, 2, 3, 4 because it has 4 neighbors, and C has a degree 1. A clique is a set of nodes in G. They are pairwise adjacent. That means that every pair of nodes in the clique are connected by one edge. So we can think that there is a clique, for instance, here. A and B belong to a clique. We can also say that A, B, F, and E belong to a clique. So we will see that when you take, for instance, A and B, they are pairwise adjacent, so they belong to a clique. And B, F, and E are also pairwise adjacent, so they belong to a clique. And we have the idea of a maximal clique. That is a clique that is not strictly contained in another clique. So, for instance, A and B, they are a clique, but they are not a maximal clique because there is another maximal clique that involves A, B, and D. So just removing this here. So we have a maximal clique that is here, right? And we can also think that, for instance, B, D, F, and E are not a clique because there is no connection between D and E. So we need that every pair of nodes in a clique to be pairwise adjacent. And when we say graph G, in this lecture, we mean the undirected graph. Otherwise, we say a DAG G. So that is going to happen because we're going to, most of the time, operate over undirected graphs. And the definitions will be over the undirected graphs. The algorithm will be over undirected graphs. And so when we mention the graph G, we are talking about these undirected graphs. So all the definitions always will be natural to the Markov networks, but we can easily extend it to the Bayesian networks by the process of moralization, as we have discussed before. Okay, now we formalize the idea of elimination order, and the elimination order for the graph is a total ordering that we call pi of nodes in the graph, where pi I is the ith node in the ordering. So we can say that we'll have an ordering like A, B, C, D, E, and F. That will be our elimination order. So it's a total order, includes all the variables, and tell us which variable should be eliminated first, second, and so on. And when we do the elimination process, and we are eliminating node X from the graph, what we obtain is a new graph. And so there is a process that we add an edge between every pair of no adjacent neighbors of X. We delete the node X, and the edges added during the elimination process are called filling edges. So we have a DAG here as one example. We have the modal graph here. So what we are doing is connecting these two parents here. They are not married, so we are connecting them during the modalization. And if we have an elimination order that is F, A, B, C, D, and E, we end up with this fill-in graph here, right? So we will add two more edges. One edge is this guy here, and the other edge is this guy here. Let's take a look at the next slide to when I do a step-by-step example of this process of creating filling edges. So this is a step-by-step illustration of creating filling edges. The elimination order is this: pi, F, A, B, C, D, and E, and this is our initial graph, that is the modal graph. So the first variable we're going to be eliminated is F, and F has two neighbors, D and E, and we need to connect those two neighbors together. When we do this, we realize that D and E are already connected, so we are not generating any new fill-in edges, so we continue the process here. So the next one is going to be the elimination of A. Now A has two neighbors, B and C. They are not connected, so we're going to create our first fill-in edge, and we're going to be this one that is created here. So we created this graph now. And next will be B, and we're going to eliminate this, and B has two neighbors. One is D, and the other one is C, that was created this neighborhood because of the filling edge, but it's still valid. In this case, we have to connect the D and C together, and going to be the resulting graph is this one. The next node to be eliminated is C, and when we eliminate C, we have to connect the neighbors D and E, but they are already connected, so nothing to do here. Now we have D and E. We're going to eliminate D, and D has only one neighbor, so there is nothing to do. And the final one is E, that we can eliminate it, and if we eliminate it, we end with no variables at all. So when we look at the filling edge that we create only two. One is this one, another one is this one, that are represented in this figure here. So when we do this elimination process, we create a graph sequence and also a cluster sequence that we're going to define in this slide. And I'm going to anticipate that for you, even though we are not going to discuss right now, that this cluster sequence will be useful to define the clusters in the joint tree. And first, let's start with the graph sequence, is exactly what we saw in the previous slide. We start with an initial graph that can be a modal graph for the Bayesian networks, or can be a Markov network. And we start eliminating the variables and inducing some filling edges. So this is the process, and we create a new graph and a new graph, and goes on until we end with our elimination process. So in this case, we eliminate F first, later on we eliminate A, B, C, D, and E. When we eliminated F, we created a cluster. So this cluster is basically the variable that we are eliminating and the neighbors. So in this case here, when we eliminated the first variable F, we're going to put F together with the two neighbors that F has, so we're going to be D and E. So we have a cluster D, E, and F. We move on, and now we're gonna eliminate the variable a. So we'll have a new cluster that is A with its neighbors B and C. So we have a cluster A, B, and C. When we eliminate B, we have a new cluster that's gonna be B, C, and D. B and its two neighbors. And we eliminated B, and now we're going to eliminate C, and C also has two neighbors. There are D and E. So when we eliminated this guy, we create a new cluster here. And finally, when eliminated D, D has just one neighbor, that's E. So we're going to create, induce this cluster here, DE. And finally, we have a final cluster that is only E with no neighbors at all. So when we do the elimination process, we created these two things, a graph sequence and a cluster sequence, and those clusters will be useful to define the joint tree later on. And now we can revisit the concept of the elimination width. So we haven't seen this before, and we defined the elimination width as the size of the largest factor minus 1. And now we're going to redefine this using this idea of induced cluster sequence. So the width of elimination order to us now will be defined as the maximum size of the cluster in the cluster sequence minus 1. So if we look here at our cluster sequence, we have a cluster of size 3, 3, 3, 3, 2, and 1. So the maximum size is 3, and the width of this elimination order will be 2. And we can extend this definition to DAGs and say that, well, here, I guess it's poorly written, and I apologize for that. The width of pi for a DAG is the width of pi for the DAG's model graph. So what I want to say is that we can extend this definition to DAGs. In this case, we need first to convert the DAG into a model graph and compute the width according to this first definition here, and but in this case now using the model graph that is an undirected graph. So you may ask why that is the case, why we are redefining the width of the elimination order, now talking about the maximum size of the clusters. And we haven't done this before by the largest factor that we haven't seen in the elimination order. And the answer is that these two ideas are compatible. Remember that in variable elimination, in order to eliminate one variable, we first need to multiply all the factors that mention that variable. And here is the same thing, right? So we are talking about eliminating the variable f, but we know that f appears in some factor with D and also with E. And we need to put all these things together. It can be one factor, it can be more than one factor. In this case here, is going to be just one factor because we have a factor that mentions f, D, and E is the factor that is the probability of f given D and E. And so at the end, in order to eliminate f, we will need to have one factor that mentions D, E, and F. Another example is here for A. In order to eliminate the variable A, we know that A appears in some factor with B, and also A appears in some factor with C. So we will have to create a factor that mentions A, B, and C. In this case, because this factor here mentions B given A, and this factor here mentions C given A, and we have a factor here that mentions just A. But we have to put these things together, and we will create a factor that mentions A, B, and C. That is actually this cluster here. And the same thing occurs for the remaining ones. So when we talk about those clusters, we are also talking about the factors that we create during the elimination process and which variables those factors mention. So when we talk about the size of the largest cluster, we are also talking about the size of the largest factor that we created during the elimination process. So the last definition that I'm going to revisit in this video is the tree width. And the tree width for graph G is defined as being the minimal width for all possible elimination orders. So we're going to consider all elimination orders that we have for a graph G and see which one has the smallest width, and this is the tree width, also known as the width of the graph G. And when we take one elimination order in particular that we want to call like pi, and it has a width that is equal to the tree width, we say that pi is optimal. And when one elimination order that I'm going to say that the name is pi does not lead to any fill-in edges, we say that pi is perfect. So of course every graph has an optimal elimination order, but not every graph has a perfect elimination order. And we see here in this example that this elimination order is optimal, but it's not perfect. So it's not perfect because we are creating filling edges during the process, but it's optimal because we cannot find another elimination order that has a width smaller than this one. And we see that, and we saw in the previous slide that this elimination order has width equal to, because the largest clusters have size 3. But we cannot expect to have an elimination order of width 2. That is the case because we already have this guy here. That's F, and F mentions it has 2 parents, so it mentions D and E. So it is already a factor of size 3, and we need to, some point of the elimination process, we needed to consider this factor F. So we cannot expect it to have an elimination order with width smaller than 2. So that's good for this video. Let's take a break, and we're going to continue in the next video discussing more about elimination order and heuristics. So see you soon.